The date was 1985. The place was Fort Bliss, Texas. On a flat stretch of Army testing ground, the future of American air defense was about to prove itself in front of the men who controlled its budget. A convoy of officials and members of Congress stood behind a line of barricades. In front of them sat a machine the Army had promised would solve a problem no other system could. A self-propelled gun that could track and destroy an enemy helicopter faster than the helicopter could fire back. Its name was the M247 Sergeant York. Its radar was supposed to be its genius, a system fast enough to lock onto a target moving at over 100 miles an hour, accurate enough to put explosive shells on a helicopter hovering at the tree line. The target drone lifted into the sky. The radar spun. And according to the story that would follow this program for the next 40 years, the turret did not track the drone at all. It turned, quietly and with total confidence, toward a stationary object on the ground, a portable latrine, its exhaust fan spinning in the wind. Nearly $2 billion had been spent to build a weapon that, as the story goes, could not tell the difference between an enemy aircraft and a bathroom fan. Whether that exact moment happened exactly as remembered is still disputed. What is not disputed is what came next: the collapse of one of the most expensive procurement failures in the history of the United States Army. By the late 1970s, the United States Army had a doctrine and a nightmare living side by side. The doctrine was air-land battle, armored columns punching deep into enemy territory, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles moving together as a single, fast-moving fist. The nightmare was the Mi-24 Hind. Soviet doctrine had built entire regiments around helicopters like the Hind, flying gun platforms designed to hunt tank columns from low altitude, firing rockets and cannon rounds into formations before retreating behind the tree line. American planners had watched Warsaw Pact exercises and drawn a simple, uncomfortable conclusion. If war came to Central Europe, U.S. armored divisions would be moving faster than their own air defenses could follow. The systems meant to protect them were already obsolete on paper. The M163 Vulcan was a Gatling gun bolted to a lightly armored chassis, effective only at close range and blind at night. The MIM-72 Chaparral fired heat-seeking missiles adapted from a Sidewinder design, useful against a jet exhaust, nearly useless against a hovering helicopter that ran cold and slow. Both systems existed only because something had failed before them. The Army's original answer, the MIM-46 Mauler, had been canceled in 1965 after its own radar and missile guidance proved unworkable. Vulcan and Chaparral were the stopgap. 15 years later, they were still the stopgap. The new M1 Abrams tank could move at speeds neither system could sustain. The M2 Bradley was entering service built for exactly the kind of high-tempo, deep-penetration warfare the Hind was designed to punish. A division of that speed and firepower, moving without adequate air cover, was not a theoretical vulnerability. It was a mathematical one. The Army needed a system that could keep pace with the tanks, track a fast-moving helicopter in real time, and put rounds on target before that helicopter could fire and disappear. It needed radar-guided guns, not heat-seeking missiles that could be defeated by countermeasures. It needed something built quickly, because the Soviet buildup was not waiting for a perfect solution. That urgency would shape every decision that followed, and it would prove, in the end, to be the most expensive impatience in the history of American air defense procurement. In 1977, the Army formalized its requirement under a name that sounded more like an engineering memo than a weapons program: the Advanced Radar-Directed Gun Air Defense System. It was quickly shortened to a name that would stick: DIVAD, Division Air Defense. The concept was straightforward. Take a proven tank chassis, mount a new turret with radar-guided autocannons, and field a vehicle that could ride alongside the Abrams and Bradley into combat. What made the program attractive to the Pentagon was not just the concept, it was the promise of speed. Rather than design a weapon system from scratch, contractors were encouraged to build using existing, off-the-shelf components: proven radars, proven guns, proven chassis. On paper, this meant lower risk, lower cost, and a faster path to the battlefield. In practice, it meant the Army was betting an entire air defense program on the assumption that borrowed parts would work as well together as they had worked apart. Two contractors answered the call: General Dynamics proposed a turret built around twin 35mm Oerlikon cannons, a system with a strong pedigree in Swiss air defense design. Ford Aerospace, the defense and electronics division of the automaker, proposed something different. Twin 40mm Bofors, L-70 guns, radar borrowed in principle from fighter aircraft, mounted on the hull of an M48 Patton tank, a design already 20 years old. Both companies built prototypes. Both were tested, and in May of 1981, the Army made its choice. Ford Aerospace had won the competition, and with it, a fixed-price development and initial production contract worth just under $7 billion. The vehicle was given an official name that carried the weight of American military legend, Sergeant York, in honor of Alvin York, the most decorated American soldier of the First World War. The Army's ambitions were not modest. Internal planning called for a fleet of 618 vehicles, enough to place air defense coverage inside every armored division the United States could field in Europe. A World War I hero's name had been placed on a machine meant to defend against a Cold War threat that had never yet been tested in real combat. The contract was signed. The clock was running. And underneath the confidence of that announcement, the compromises that had made the program fast and affordable were already beginning to define what kind of machine Sergeant York would actually become. To understand what went wrong with the M247 Sergeant York, it helps to understand what it was actually made of, because very little of it was new. The hull was a Patton. Specifically, the chassis and running gear of the M48, a main battle tank that had entered service in the early 1950s and had already been surpassed twice over by the M60 and the M1 Abrams. Choosing it was not a mistake in isolation. It was cheap, plentiful, and mechanically well understood. But it meant that from the ground up, Sergeant York was being built on a foundation designed for a different war. The radar was the program's proudest claim and its deepest liability. Ford's system was derived in principle from fighter aircraft radar technology, fast scanning, designed to track aerial targets moving at speed. What worked inside the nose cone of an F-16, flying above the clutter of the Earth, was a very different engineering problem when mounted low to the ground, staring across a battlefield full of trees, buildings, vehicles, and terrain that scattered radar returns in every direction. An airborne radar rarely has to ask whether the object in front of it is a helicopter or a hillside. A ground-based radar has to answer that question every second it is switched on. Then there were the guns. The twin 40mm Bofors L-70 cannons were a proven design, used by air defense forces around the world for decades. But the specific barrels installed on early production vehicles were not new manufacture. They were pulled from Army stockpiles, reconditioned units that had originally equipped the older M42 Duster, a Vietnam-era anti-aircraft gun that had been retired years earlier. Stored improperly for years, a number of these barrels had developed a slight twist, a warping invisible to the eye, but capable of throwing off the precision the entire fire control system was designed around. None of these choices were reckless in isolation. A borrowed hull, a repurposed radar concept, reconditioned gun barrels. Each decision could be defended on its own terms as a reasonable way to save time and money on a program racing against a perceived Soviet threat. But nobody had fully tested whether these three systems, developed independently for different purposes by different engineering teams, would function as a single coherent weapon. They had built a machine assembled from parts that had each proven themselves before, flying alone, on their own vehicles, solving their own problems. Sergeant York would have to make all three work together in real time against a moving target, or it would fail publicly and expensively. And in the earliest rounds of testing, the cracks in that assumption were already beginning to show. Testing began, and almost immediately, the radar started failing at the one job it had been built for. The problem had a name familiar to every radar engineer: ground clutter. A radar system scanning low across open terrain does not see a clean, empty sky. It sees trees swaying in the wind, vehicles moving in the distance, birds, terrain features, even heat shimmer off the ground, all of it bouncing signal back to the receiver, all of it competing with the actual target for the system's attention. Airborne radar, built for Ford's original design lineage, had never needed to solve this problem at this scale. Sergeant York's radar, mounted low and scanning across a cluttered battlefield, struggled to separate a moving helicopter from a stand of trees swaying at the same approximate speed. Then came a problem that should have been caught on a drafting table, not a test range. When the twin 40mm guns elevated to engage a high-angle target, precisely the kind of shot needed against a helicopter popping up from behind cover, the barrels themselves rose into the radar's direct line of sight. The weapon built to shoot down aircraft was, in certain firing positions, physically blinding its own tracking system with its own guns. The reaction time told its own story. Against a helicopter that was not maneuvering, sitting still in a hover, the easiest possible target the system could ever be asked to engage, Sergeant York needed 10 to 11 seconds to acquire, track, and prepare to fire. 10 to 11 seconds is an eternity in air defense. A real hind pilot, trained to pop up from cover, fire, and drop back down in a matter of seconds, would never present a target that stationary for that long. Against a genuine combat helicopter using real tactics, the system's reaction window was effectively meaningless. The turret itself compounded the problem. Its traverse, the speed at which the entire gun mount could rotate to follow a target, was too slow to keep pace with a fast-crossing aircraft. A helicopter did not need to outrun Sergeant York's shells. It only needed to outrun Sergeant York's turret. Inside the program, these were not secrets. Engineers and test officers documented the failures in reports that moved up the chain of command. But the Army was under its own pressure. A schedule to keep, a Soviet threat to answer, a budget already committed. Test results were interpreted generously. Failures were described as fixable engineering issues rather than fundamental design flaws. The gap between what the data showed and what the program's leadership was willing to say publicly was widening, and it would not stay hidden for long. By 1984, the Sergeant York program had survived years of internal test failures, but it could not survive what happened next in full public view. The Army arranged a live-fire demonstration at Fort Bliss, Texas, for an audience that included senior defense officials and members of Congress, the people who controlled whether the program's funding would continue. This was not a routine internal test. It was a performance, staged specifically to reassure the skeptics who had been reading the classified failure reports and asking harder questions with every budget cycle. A target drone was sent into the air to simulate an attacking helicopter. The radar was supposed to acquire it, track it, and demonstrate in front of the men who signed the checks that Sergeant York could do the one thing it had been built to do. What happened next became one of the most repeated stories in the history of American weapons procurement. According to the account that has circulated for decades among defense analysts, journalists, and veterans of the program, the radar did not lock onto the drone at all. Instead, it fixed on a stationary object at the edge of the test range, a latrine trailer, its exhaust fan spinning steadily in the Texas wind. To a radar system already struggling to separate real targets from ground clutter, a spinning fan blade may have presented a more consistent, trackable signature than an aircraft in flight. It is important to be precise about what is and is not confirmed. This exact incident, the radar locking specifically onto a portable toilet, has never been verified in the Army's official records of the test, and some historians and engineers who worked on the program have disputed the story's details or denied it happened exactly as told. What is not in dispute is the broader truth the story has always stood in for, that Sergeant York's radar, in test after test, showed a persistent inability to reliably distinguish a genuine airborne target from background clutter, and that officials in the audience that day left unconvinced, regardless of which stationary object the radar may or may not have chosen instead of the drone. Whether or not that specific moment happened exactly as remembered, the reaction in Washington was immediate and real. Members of Congress who had watched the demonstration in person began asking pointed public questions. Reporters who had been covering the program's ballooning costs found a story that finally made the technical failures legible to a general audience. Nobody needed an engineering degree to understand a weapon that couldn't find its own target. The demonstration, intended to buy the program more time, instead became the moment its political support began to collapse. A nearly $2 billion program had reached the point where its failures were no longer contained in classified test reports. They were now a story, one repeated in hearing rooms, in newspapers, and eventually in the history of American defense procurement itself. Sergeant York had survived years of quiet technical failure. It would not survive being made into a punchline in public. A weapons program with $2 billion already spent does not disappear after one bad afternoon in Texas. It fights to survive, and for the better part of a year, Sergeant York fought hard. The Army's position was that the program's problems were solvable, that the radar's clutter rejection software could be refined, that the reaction time could be improved with further tuning, that the fundamental concept remained sound even if the execution needed more work. Ford Aerospace made a similar case to its own stakeholders and to Congress. Billions had already been invested, production lines were running, and canceling now would mean losing that investment entirely while leaving American armored divisions without any answer to the Soviet helicopter threat at all. It was, in essence, an argument built on sunk cost. The money already spent became a reason to keep spending, rather than a warning to stop. But the political ground had shifted, and it would not shift back. The demonstration at Fort Bliss had done something no internal test report ever could. It had made the program's failures simple enough for a member of Congress with no engineering background to understand and repeat to a reporter. Sergeant York became a fixture in a broader argument that was already gaining momentum in Washington. A growing movement of defense reform advocates, some inside the Pentagon and many in Congress, who argued that the American procurement system consistently favored ambitious promises over honest testing, and that programs like Dive-AD were the predictable result. The formal test results gave the critics numbers they could put in a headline. Independent evaluation of the system found that Sergeant York failed 22 of the 163 test requirements it had been measured against. Not marginal shortfalls, but failures across categories the Army itself had defined as essential to the weapon's basic function. 22 out of 163 was not a program with a few bugs left to fix. It was a program that had not met the standard it was built to meet, more than a year after entering testing, on a fixed-price contract that had already consumed the budget meant to cover exactly this kind of correction. Congressional hearings turned increasingly hostile. Senators and representatives who had once accepted Army assurances at face value now demanded independent data, and the Army found itself defending not just a weapon system, but its own credibility as a testing authority. Every new report that emerged made the same case in slightly different language. The fundamental architecture of Sergeant York, the borrowed radar, the reconditioned barrels, the aging chassis, had never been capable of meeting the mission it was designed for, no matter how much additional funding was applied to it. By the time the debate reached its final stage in Washington, the question was no longer whether Sergeant York could be fixed. The question was who would be the one to finally say, on the record, that it could not. The final word belonged to one man, and he had been watching the program's collapse for months. Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense under President Reagan, presided over one of the largest peacetime military buildups in American history. His tenure was defined by expanding, not cutting, the defense budget, which made his eventual decision on Sergeant York carry even more weight. This was not a defense secretary looking for an excuse to trim spending. This was a defense secretary who had built his reputation on funding exactly the kind of programs Dive-AD represented, forced to conclude that this particular one could not be saved. The pressure came from multiple directions at once. Congress, having watched the Fort Bliss demonstration and read the 22 of 163 test results, was no longer willing to authorize continued funding without a clear resolution. The broader defense reform movement, a loose coalition of legislators, retired officers, and Pentagon officials who had spent years arguing that American weapons programs were approved on optimistic promises rather than honest data, held up Sergeant York as their central example. And within the Army itself, officers who would have to deploy the system in an actual war were losing confidence that it could perform the one function that justified its existence, protecting soldiers from an airborne threat faster than that threat could kill them. In August of 1985, Weinberger made the call. The Sergeant York program was terminated. The final numbers told the story in a way no test report could soften. Just under $2 billion had been spent developing and producing a weapon system the Army had originally planned to field in a fleet of 618 vehicles. 50 had actually been built. The gap between those two numbers, 618 promised, 50 delivered, was the clearest possible measurement of how far the program had fallen short of its original ambition. For the defense reform movement, the cancellation was validation. Sergeant York became the case study cited in hearing after hearing, The shorthand example whenever a senator wanted to argue that a weapons program was being pushed forward on political momentum rather than demonstrated capability. For the soldiers who would have relied on it in a European war that, fortunately, never came, the cancellation left a harder question unanswered. If not Sergeant York, then what? Cancellation does not erase a weapon system. It just decides what happens to the machines that already exist, and for most of the 50 Sergeant Yorks that rolled off Ford Aerospace's production line, that fate was almost as unceremonious as the program's ending. The majority were sent to military test ranges, where they served out the rest of their existence as targets, vehicles used to calibrate and validate the very weapon systems that would eventually replace the capability Sergeant York had failed to provide. A machine built to destroy enemy aircraft spent its final years being destroyed itself, absorbing rounds fired by newer systems built from the lessons of its own failure. A small number escaped that end. A handful of M247s survive today in museums and static displays across the country, among them a preserved example at the Sergeant Alvin C. York State Historic Park in Tennessee. A quiet, permanent irony, a machine that never fired a shot in anger, sitting in tribute to the World War I soldier whose name it carried into a very different kind of failure. What the cancellation did not solve was the problem that had started the entire program in the first place. American armored divisions still needed a way to defend themselves against low-flying helicopters and aircraft while keeping pace with the M1 Abrams and M2 Bradley. Sergeant York's failure did not make that threat disappear. It only erased the answer the Army thought it had found. For years afterward, U.S. divisions continued to rely on the aging, limited M163 Vulcan and My M72 Chaparral systems that Sergeant York had been built to replace in the first place. The same stopgap systems judged inadequate a decade earlier, kept in service not because they had improved, but because nothing better had survived the process meant to replace them. The gap in the sky that had justified the entire program in 1977 was still there in 1985. The only thing that had changed was that the Army now had a $2 billion lesson in exactly how not to close it. Every failed weapons program eventually becomes one of two things: a forgotten line item in a defense budget archive, or a lesson that gets taught long after the hardware itself has been scrapped. Sergeant York became the second kind. In the decades since its cancellation, the M247 has become a fixture in military academies, defense acquisition courses, and Pentagon reform discussions, not because of what it was, but because of what it revealed. The program became shorthand for a specific failure mode in weapons development: the temptation to build a system by combining components that had each proven themselves individually, without ever fully testing whether they could function as one coherent whole. A fighter radar, a tank chassis, and reconditioned artillery barrels had each done their jobs before. Nobody had proven they could do the job together, and the Army found that out in front of Congress instead of finding it out in a classified test report where it could have been fixed quietly. The program's collapse also fed directly into a wave of defense acquisition reform that followed through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. Legislative efforts aimed at forcing earlier, more independent testing before a program could receive full production funding, precisely so that another Sergeant York could not consume $2 billion before its fundamental flaws became undeniable in public. The contrast with America's actual adversary made the failure sting even more. The Soviet ZSU-23-4 Shilka, a far simpler radar-guided anti-aircraft system, had entered service more than a decade before Sergeant York was even conceived and remained in active use with Warsaw Pact and Allied forces for decades after. West Germany's Gepard, built on a similar concept to Sergeant York, twin radar-guided autocannons on a tank chassis, succeeded where the American program failed, entering service in the 1970s and remaining in NATO inventories for years. The concept behind Sergeant York was never the problem. The execution was. What the program ultimately proved was not that radar-guided air defense was impossible. It was that a demonstration built to look convincing and a weapon system built to actually function are not the same achievement, and mistaking one for the other is a mistake. Measured not in embarrassment, but in billions of dollars and years of unresolved vulnerability. Sergeant York never fired a shot at an enemy aircraft. It never had the chance. Its entire war was fought on a test range in Texas against a target it was supposed to hit, and somewhere in that failure, In the space between what a weapon appears to do and what it can actually do sits the only lesson the program ever successfully delivered.